So, by uttering these few words, one affirms one's full membership of Islam. But although the theologians aver that because of God's mercy, however much one sins, one cannot be punished eternally if one has affirmed this shahada, it's recognized that one's Islam is gravely lacking if one goes no further. You have to accept the entailment of Muhammad's prophecy, the other four pillars. These are the fingers to the shahada's thumb. The second pillar of Islam is, of course, in Arabic, Salat, usually translated not very comfortably in English as the prayer with a capital P. In a sense, it isn't really primarily a prayer, it's a kind of worship. It's an act of worship, it's a formal submission and adoration of the divine. This is the formal 5 times daily worship that you'll see going on in the mosque here. It's the key religious practice of Islam, more important than the others. The Prophet called it the center pole of the religion. Whoever demolishes it has demolished Islam. The basic meaning of this word salat in Arabic is a kind of connection, a connection through prayer or blessing or an association with holiness. So in the Quran we find that God and his angels also engage in a kind of salat in the sense of blessing mankind. Surah 33 verse 43 says, "It is he, i.e. God, who performs the salat over you and his angels that he may bring you forth from darkness into light." In another passage, the Quran affirms that salat is actually the practice and the norm of all creatures. Surah 24 verse 41 says, "Have you not seen that everything in the heavens and the earth glorifies God, and the birds spreading their wings? Each one knows its salat and its glorification." And elsewhere, Surah 21 verse 73, for instance, the text declares that earlier prophets, such as Abraham and Lot, also performed salat. So this Quranic model shows that the term itself actually has a very wide application, and that the formal worship which is instituted in Islam is simply the Muslim extension of a universal cosmic pattern in which God, the angels, the creatures, and all earlier prophets have all participated. So what's the specifically Muslim form of this universal practice? Well, the hadith outline it in some detail. Generally, the Quran lays down guidelines and global principles, and the detailed working out of these principles are in the hadith. So you won't find a description of how to do the salat in the Quran. The objective is to pray as the Prophet himself prayed. And one of the interesting things about Muslim worship is that if you go into a mosque, the rituals you will see have remained unchanged for 1400 years. You are seeing, as it were, a glimpse of the distant past. Now, the characteristically Muslim form of salat is something that acknowledges the mutual interdependence of the body and the soul. These two things are in the Islamic vision closely intertwined. Islamic civilization has never accepted the Cartesian body-soul or mind-soul or mind-body dichotomy. What you do to the body has an effect on the soul and vice versa. And the Prophet said that man is closest to his Lord when in prostration. And this is the culminating rite of the salat, the act of touching one's forehead to the earth, this humble matter from which we were made and to which we will return. And in the Semitic tradition, generally the forehead is the symbol of pride. So this culminating act of the prayer represents the quintessence of Islam, submission to the omnipotent, majestic celestial king. This prostration, sajda, is the culmination of the salat. It happens several times during each cycle of prayer. Each cycle is called rak'ah. I don't think there's that much point in going through the detailed rulings on how to do the prayer here. You can learn it probably more efficiently just by watching what goes on in the mosque. Very briefly, though, the salat works as follows. Before you can pray, and also before you recite the Quran, the Muslim has to ensure that he or she is physically clean from any bodily wastes, which is why in Muslim communities, Muslim houses, Muslim countries, water is always provided in bathrooms. Using paper or whatever is not considered sufficient. You have to be completely clean. Even one drop of waste matter on the body will render the prayer null and void. This again has certain symbolic significance, the body being a metaphor for the soul. Once this has been done, there is the rite of wudu, which is the formal washing that takes place before the prayer can be done. And this is a very brief, concentrated, stylized, almost Zen-like ritual in which the hands, the forearms, the face, the ears and the feet all have to be cleansed with pure running water. The symbolism of this obviously is obvious. As in Christianity, the rite of baptism uses water as an image of divine mercy, water being what comes from heaven. But the rite has a practical significance as well. Physical cleanliness in a mosque is extremely important because close physical proximity is normal. So to supply clean water for these ablutions, mosques have fountains in their courtyard, or at least they'll have a row of taps. Water is also required for the hammam, the public bath, which until very recently in Muslim communities was a very important feature of life, the famous Turkish bath. And it's an interesting fact that historians are only just beginning to recognize that one reason why medieval Muslim cities were so big, I mentioned that Cordoba had 1 million people in it, whereas medieval cities in Northern Europe had a lot fewer, was the very practical consequence of the liturgical requirement that clean water be delivered to the city. Whenever Muslims captured a town or founded a town, the first thing they had to do was to establish a place of worship. Before they could worship, they had to have clean water that didn't taste of anything, that didn't smell. These are the canonical requirements. And the provision of clean running water was in Muslim societies a very important means of circumventing some waterborne diseases, so that cholera and various kinds of plagues were actually less common in medieval Muslim societies than they were elsewhere. It wasn't just Cordoba, places like Baghdad, Cairo, and a few other cities also had well over 1 million inhabitants. Anyway, that's by way of a footnote. Once the wudu is completed, one recites the Shahada, and then the Muslim is in the state of what's academically referred to as ritual purity. And this state enables him to approach the sacred. He or she can touch a copy of the Quran, can enter the sanctuary in Mecca, and can perform the Salat. It's perhaps a Cambridge vice, by the way, that I use the male pronoun. But the important point to bear in mind is that the 5 pillars of Islam are equally incumbent on both of the sexes. Even the Hajj, which often is more difficult for women than it is for men, is just as incumbent for women as it is for men. So how does the prayer itself work? Well, it doesn't have to take place in a mosque. There is no rite of consecration. The prayers we do in the mosque here could just as easily be done outside in the car park. It's just that a mosque is a special place where it's easier to concentrate on the divine and excludes other more profane activities. The worshipper has to stand in a clean place, hence shoes which can bring in impurity. Sorry.
I have a point of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
As a practical matter, I wouldn't think most people pray in the mosque 5 times a day. Is that correct? I mean, if you're going about your business and the shop's closed or something,
right,
you might simply pray there. Would that not be correct?
It depends very much where you are. In some countries like Saudi Arabia, they actually close the shops at the time of prayer.
And is this ritual cleansing done? Is it a requirement every time?
Not every time, no. It's preferable to do it every time, but the ritual purity is actually broken if you go to the toilet. You have to do it again if you've discharged bodily wastes. That's the rule. But generally people can pray 2 or 3 prayers together, and maybe they'll do the wudu 2 or 3 times a day, depending. But although the prayer doesn't have to be done in the mosque, generally people prefer it, and the Prophet explained that it's more meritorious to do it in congregation. Generally, it's easier to concentrate somehow if other people are doing the same thing as you are. But very often you'll find, yes, a majority of at least the male population will be praying in the mosques 5 times a day. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, I would attend just a little local mosque that was around the corner from me, and at the dawn prayer you would have about 400 or 500 people there, which would probably represent about half of the population of the street. And in villages as well. In villages, certainly the majority of the population will attend. Women can attend mosques, and most mosques provide space for women, including the sacred mosques, Mecca, Medina and Jerusalem. But there is a dispensation. They're not obliged to. It's not quite as important for them as it is for men, because they have family responsibilities as well, in the traditional view of things. Although women are attending mosques a lot more than they used to. Does that answer your question? Okay. Briefly, to run over the actual mechanics of the prayer. You have to stand in a clean place. The only place you can't pray, by the way, is in a lavatory or a bathroom. You have to face the Kaaba in Mecca, which is the earthly symbol of the divine presence. And the prayer actually begins when the worshipper raises his or her hands flat behind the ears and then brings them down like this, Allahu Akbar, and usually crosses them on the chest, although sometimes, particularly in North Africa, you'll see people with their hands by the side. Both are perfectly acceptable. And this word Allahu Akbar that begins the prayer, this phrase means God is greater. Again, it's one of these slightly hermetic utterances that Islam likes. La ilaha illallah, no God but God. Allahu Akbar, God is greater. Greater than what? Well, obviously greater than everything. So when you're doing this, Allahu Akbar, it's as if you're affirming or reaffirming the fact that the divine reality is what is really important and greater than whatever you've been doing in the previous few hours. And this practice is, as it were, a symbol of pushing behind you all of the things that might have been occupying your mind and your soul. Once this is done, the worshipper recites the first surah of the Quran, the famous Fatiha. That's an obligation in the prayer. And then he will say Ameen, or the members of the congregation will say Ameen, which is just the Arabic version of Amen, means the same. And then will recite any other passage of the Quran that he or she chooses. During the second and third prayers of the day, those are the prayers done at noon and mid-afternoon, and also in all optional prayers, the recitation is done silently. Otherwise it's allowed, i.e. the dawn prayer, sunset prayer and the night prayer are said aloud. All Quranic recitation has to be done in Arabic, because this links the worshipper to the actual sound and form of the pre-existent divine word. Arabic is a sacred language. Once the Quranic recitation is completed, he or she says Allahu Akbar again and bows down in the position known as ruku', hands on knees. There you repeat the phrase Subhana Rabbil Azim, which means glory be to my Lord, the tremendous, 3 or more times. Then he stands again and then goes down into the prostration. And during the prostration, people say all kinds of things, but the Prophet recommended things like Subhana Rabbil A'la, glory be to my Lord, the Most High. Then he sits back on his haunches and repeats another brief formula or prayer and then prostrates again. And once that second prostration is over, then the first rak'ah, or cycle of prayers, has been completed. And the number of rak'ahs in each prayer differs. There are 2 in the dawn prayer, 4 in the noon, afternoon and night prayer, and 3 in the sunset prayer. So the 5 daily prayers are, just to reiterate, first of all, the dawn prayer, which is between first light and sunrise. The second is shortly after noon. Second is mid-afternoon. Third is mid-afternoon, rather. Fourthly, sunset. And fifthly, nightfall. That's when it's completely dark, say an hour and a half after the sun sets. The actual length of the thing, it's perfectly possible to finish a prayer in 2 minutes and be out of the mosque again. 5-10 minutes is more usual. Again, the imams in different mosques will have different ways of doing things. And in Muslim cities where there are lots of mosques within walking distance, people will, depending on the amount of time they've got, go to the mosque where they know the service is going to be long or short, or where they like the sound of the recitation or whatever. One can do these things very briefly, and it depends really on one's circumstances. I remember once I was waiting at a railway station in Yugoslavia. This was about 3-4 years ago. And it was 5 in the morning, and the train wasn't coming for hours. And so I thought, well, I'll do the dawn prayer. And so there I was on my little prayer carpet, nobody around, and I thought, I can make this a nice long prayer. And then into the station steamed this filthy train full of about maybe 5,000 Serbs who looked pretty drunk, I could see out of the corner of my eye. And I thought, perhaps this is not the best sight for a group of angry young Serbs. And so I did what was probably the most rapid performance of the Muslim prayer in recorded history and disappeared. But so the actual length of it is at people's discretion, depending on mood and situation. Now, this is the obligatory prayer, 5 of them every day, but there are a lot of optional prayers, and these are taken very seriously. You'll see in the mosque here, people don't just do the congregational prayer in the line. Once that's finished, or before it starts, they'll scatter into other parts of the mosque and pray separately. There are other times of day when the Prophet also liked to pray, and pious Muslims like to emulate these. For instance, most importantly, something called the tahajjud prayer. This is said in the middle of the night. People wake up for it. My mother-in-law, for instance, who's from Pakistan, I've lived in her house for some time and observed her movements. Every night she gets up at about 2 in the morning, makes herself a cup of tea, and then prays this tahajjud prayer for a couple of hours, and then goes to sleep again for an hour or so before the dawn prayer. And in her social world, that's very normal. The tahajjud prayer can be a very large number of rak'ahs. You can recite very long surahs of the Quran. More or less you can do what you like. And this is generally the prayer that is taken most seriously by very devout, spiritually minded Muslims. The formal congregational prayers during the day are an important assertion of communal solidarity, the equality of believers, etc., etc. But the tahajjud is when the real spiritual work is traditionally done. It's done usually at home. Occasionally, and in some mosques, there is a form of tahajjud prayer that's done in congregation. For mosques where there's a very strong interest in nocturnal vigils. And you'll see this during the month of Ramadan in the great mosque in Mecca. If you turn up there at about 3 in the morning during Ramadan, you'll see perhaps 500,000 people all doing tahajjud together. And it's actually very impressive. Most things about Mecca are just visually stunning. And I remember the first time I got there, I was pretty late and the prayer had almost finished. And I couldn't believe it, but I could hardly find a place in this mosque which has, its official capacity is about 700,000. But in reality it gets pretty crowded and probably you get 1 million people in there. And I could hardly find a place to stand. And I was there at 3 in the morning, went up one of the escalators. There are 24 huge escalators that take you up to the roof because there's no room downstairs or on the first floor. So you have 250,000 people praying on the roof. I found myself a little space at the back and I saw that the floor was actually wet and I thought, it's been raining, that's pretty weird for Mecca. And after 5 minutes or so, I realized it was because so many people were crying. The force of the occasion, the awe that they felt before God's house, the holy month, the effect of the fasting, the recitation of the Quran overpowered people, and many of them were actually in tears. So it's a very, very powerful thing. Other optional prayers, there's something called the duha prayer, which some people do, that's D-U-H-A, which is said in the mid-morning. Another optional prayer. Another one called the awabin, which is said between the sunset and night prayers. On Fridays, there is the congregational prayer that comes complete with a sermon. Not to everybody's delight, but one listens to it. The Prophet said that this should be short, but in reality, it's sometimes longer than some people would wish. Some things, it seems, are common to all religions. And this is an obligation. While it's strongly recommended to attend the 5 daily prayers in congregation, it's an obligation to attend the Jummah, a Friday prayer. Jummah, yeah.
That's the Friday.
That's the Friday congregational prayer, which takes the place of the noon prayer. Jummah just means assembly or congregation. This little squiggle here is a kind of glottal stop. Arabic has a lot of sounds like that, which we can't represent very easily in English. What does the mosque actually look like? Well, it has very few features that one really needs to know about. I've said that the classical form of it is the cube surmounted by a dome, which is a favoured form in Islamic architecture generally, like this room, for instance. It has something called a mihrab. The word means a niche, and this is the little alcove which indicates the direction of Mecca, so that people don't pray towards Pittsburgh or whatever. There's also something called the minbar, which you'll see in almost all mosques, including our one here. A minbar is a pulpit where the imam stands to deliver his Friday disquisition. Traditionally, the imam doesn't stand at the top of it. There's a tradition that only the Prophet could stand at the top, and out of respect for his memory, the imam stands on a lower stair. Minaret is not necessarily tall in a mosque, although it's traditional. In fact, the original mosque founded by the Prophet in Mecca didn't have a minaret. The aesthetic of mosques does vary hugely, as I've said. There are mosques in China that look almost indistinguishable from Confucian temples, and so on. The collective prayer has to be led by an imam. The word simply means somebody who goes out in front. So the word can also have political meanings. The imam of a state, for instance, is the head of the state, somebody who's in front of the rest. He is not an ordained minister in any sense, because there are no sacraments that he's administering, no communion, no baptism, or whatever. So any adult member of the congregation can serve as imam, as long as he can recite the Quran coherently. His function basically is largely to mark time so that people are doing the same thing at the same time, to ensure the proper coordination of the movements of the congregation. But since part of his responsibility is to recite the Quran in a beautiful, mellifluous voice, which is something that the Prophet himself insisted on, usually somebody is chosen who has a good voice and has memorized a lot of the Quran. Very often you'll find it's somebody who's memorized the entire Quran. Such a person being known as a hafiz, meaning a memorizer or a container. Estimated there are 3 million of these in the Muslim world. It's a traditional accomplishment. Overwhelmingly, the consensus of Islamic law is that the imam of a mosque, if it's a male or a mixed congregation, has to be male. There is the beginnings of an argument now akin to the argument over the ordination of women in Christianity, although obviously it's not an exact parallel because there's no ordination, no sacraments to dish out. There are a few medieval scholars who say that women can lead men in prayer, but their views are very rarely heeded. One or two mosques in South Africa, I think, where they have women imams. But women can lead other women in prayer. Congregational prayer is famously announced to the community, not by bells, but by this chant known as the adhan, or the call to prayer, which is sung out by the mu'adhin from traditionally atop a minaret. And I've included a transliteration and an English translation in the handouts. You should note that the adhan for the dawn prayer adds the words as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm, which means prayer is better than sleep. Congregational prayer, as I've said, doesn't have to be in a mosque. Very often, if you travel through rural districts in the Muslim world where people have been working in the fields, you'll see they just put out a few sheets of cardboard and pray by the side of the road or by the side of their fields. A hadith says, "The whole world is pure and has been made a mosque for my community." Interestingly, the Saudi Prince Salman, who was allegedly the first Muslim in space, had no trouble saying his prayers aboard the space shuttle. But typically very crowded places like railway stations, public libraries, universities, airports will have mosques attached. There's even a mosque at Heathrow Airport in London, for instance, which is quite well used. Beautiful mosque at Amsterdam Airport now.